The rooftop was 40 stories above the city, and Draven Malkavian was going to step off the edge. Rosalie Ashborne saw it the moment she pushed through the maintenance door, her arms full of fresh linens she had been carrying to the upper guest suites, when the elevator indicator had shown the penthouse roof access lighting up at 3 in the morning. She had told herself it was nothing. She had learned in her 8 months of service at Malkavian Tower that the things which happened in the dark hours were never nothing. She had learned to pay attention to the details that everyone else chose to ignore. The wind hit her immediately, tearing at her dark hair, plastering her uniform against her body. The linens scattered from her arms and sailed out into the black sky like white birds fleeing a storm. She did not chase them. She was already moving toward the figure, standing at the very edge of the parapet, white hair whipping around a face that was carved from pale marble, silver eyes fixed on the drop below with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not anger, not that cold aristocratic distance he wore like armor. Something far more terrible than either of those things. He looked emptied. He looked finished. "Lord Malkavian," she said, keeping her voice steady even though her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. He did not look at her. His long black coat moved around him like wings. His hands were loose at his sides, and she noticed, with a cold drop of her stomach, that his fingers were not gripping the stone railing. They were resting against it the way a person rests their hand against a door they are about to walk through. "Go back inside, Rosalie," he said. His voice was quiet. That was what frightened her most. Draven Malkavian was never quiet. He was thunderstorms and absolute commands, and a presence so overwhelming that grown men flinched when he entered a room. This softness was wrong in a way she could not fully name. "I do not think I will," she said, and kept walking toward him. He turned his head then, just slightly, and the city lights caught the edge of his face. Silver eyes found her across the rooftop, and for a moment something moved in them. Surprise, perhaps, or the barest flicker of something that had not been there a moment before. "You are the maid," he said. "I am aware," she replied, and came to stand beside him at the parapet. She did not grab him. She did not plead. She simply stood beside him and looked out at the city the way he was looking at it, the whole sprawl of glass and light and human motion below, and she said, very quietly, "Tell me what happened." And because she asked it like she meant it, because there was no performance in her voice, and no fear of him, and no practiced deference, because she was simply there beside him, like a person standing beside another person, at the edge of something enormous, he told her. It took 3 hours. By the time the sky began to lighten at the horizon, they were sitting on the rooftop with their backs against the parapet, and Rosalie understood 3 things with absolute clarity. The first was that Draven Malkavian was in the kind of pain that did not announce itself, the kind that moved silently through an immortal life accumulating like sediment, until one night it simply became too much weight to carry. The second was that someone inside his own court had betrayed him in a way that had cost him everything he had spent 400 years building. And the third was that she was almost certainly going to get herself killed for knowing it. She had not always been invisible. That was the thing people assumed when they looked at her, that she had always been the sort of woman who moved through rooms unnoticed, who carried things and straightened things and replenished things, while the world's important people talked above her head. They assumed that because it was easier than looking at her directly and registering what was actually there. She had learned that most people did not see what they were not looking for, and so she had cultivated the skill of being unremarkable. It was, in its own way, a kind of power. She had taken the position at Malkavian Tower for reasons that had nothing to do with the generous pay package or the housing stipend. She had taken it because her younger brother, Theo, was sick in the way that required very specific and very expensive treatment, and the Malkavian house benefits package covered it fully under its unusual and comprehensive human employee contract. She had read every line of that contract, twice. It was one of several things that had told her, before she ever set foot in the building, that Draven Malkavian was not what he was rumored to be. The rumors said he was a monster, a conqueror, a vampire lord so ancient and so dangerous that 3 other vampire houses had standing alliances purely to avoid his attention. The rumors said he had once destroyed an entire bloodline for the crime of stealing territory that bordered his own. The rumors said his silver eyes could compel any human into a trance from which they would not return without his permission. The contract said something different. The contract said that human employees were entitled to full medical coverage, including experimental treatments, that they could not be compelled without written consent renewed annually, that they were guaranteed safe transport at all hours, and that any vampire within the household who fed from an employee without explicit ongoing consent would be immediately and permanently expelled. She had read that clause 4 times, and then sat quietly for a long while, thinking about what it meant, that a vampire lord had written it. She had been working in the tower for 2 months before she saw him for the first time. She had heard him, of course. The upper floors resonated with his presence in the way that charged air resonates before a lightning strike. The other maids talked about him in hushed, slightly breathless voices. Elena, the head housekeeper, simply said his name with the gravity of a prayer when she needed the junior staff to understand that something was non-negotiable. The first time Rosalie saw Draven Malkavian, he was standing in the main corridor of the 42nd floor at 2 in the morning, dressed in a suit so precisely tailored it looked like architecture, with his white hair pulled back and his silver eyes moving across a document with an expression of complete and focused intelligence. He was flanked by 2 of his court advisors, both of them ancient and composed, and he was telling them something in a voice so low she could not make out the words. She was pushing a linen cart. He did not look at her. None of them did. She passed within 6 feet of the most powerful vampire lord in the Northern Territory, and she might as well have been a ghost. She had not minded. She had noted his face, the extraordinary sharpness of it, the way authority sat on him, not like a costume, but like a natural fact, and she had filed it carefully alongside everything else she was learning and kept moving. Over the following months, she had learned the rhythms of the tower the way she learned everything, methodically and without announcing herself. She learned which floors the court members occupied and what their patterns were. She learned that the ancient vampire named Vothric, who served as Draven's head of security, had a habit of inspecting the lower floors between midnight and 2 that was not officially on any schedule but never varied. She learned that the beautiful and terrifying Seraphine, who held the title of court diplomat, received private communications on a channel separate from the house system and always deleted them personally. She learned that the young vampire Kaelin, who seemed to serve no clearly defined role but was always present at Draven's shoulder during formal proceedings, watched the Lord with an expression that was 1 degree too studied to be simple loyalty. She had not said anything about any of it. It was not her place, and more than that, she had no certainty. Observations were not evidence. Patterns were not proof. She had kept her head down and done her work, and let herself be invisible, and she had told herself that whatever was moving in the shadows of this court, it was not her problem. Then came the night of the accord, signing. The accord was something she had heard, discussed in fragments, and carefully omitted references for 3 months, before she understood what it actually was. It was an agreement between Draven's house and the 2 oldest remaining vampire houses in the Eastern Territories, the House of Varric and the House of Sorvain. The accord would end a territorial Cold War that had been running since before she was born, would establish formal trade and protection agreements between the 3 great houses, and would functionally make Draven the architectural center of the most powerful vampire coalition the continent had ever seen. It was, by any measure, the most significant political achievement of his 4-century existence. It was also, she had come to understand in the weeks before it happened, a trap. She'd been cleaning the East Corridor during a meeting that was not supposed to be a meeting. Seraphine and Kalen, standing in what they believed was an empty alcove, voices dropped to a register that would have been inaudible to human ears, would have been, if Rosalie had not spent the previous 4 months training herself to anticipate the acoustics of every corridor in the building so that she could time her movements to avoid being a distraction. The alcove had a particular quality of reflected sound that funneled directly to the cleaning station 12 feet away. She had heard enough. The accord documents had been altered. Not obviously, not clumsily, but in the precise and technical language of vampire blood law, which dealt not in ordinary contract language, but in binding declarations that, once sealed with the mark of a house lord, became irrevocable for the duration of that lord's existence. The alterations would not be visible to anyone who was not specifically looking for them, and who did not have fluency in the archaic legal dialect of the old court language. The altered clauses would create a situation in which Draven, upon signing, would be legally bound by vampire blood law to a subordinate alliance structure that he believed to be an equal partnership. The House of Varric would hold ultimate territorial authority. Draven's centuries of work would be handed to someone else, and the betrayal went deeper than that. The final clause, buried in language so ancient it predated modern vampire court usage, was what stopped her cold. It declared that in the event of a blood law violation by the subordinated party, which in the altered version would include any act of territorial assertion, Draven took in his own lands, the penalty was expulsion from all recognized vampire courts. It was the vampire equivalent of exile. It was the destruction of everything he was. She had been invisible for 8 months. She had been careful and patient and unremarkable, and she had stood in that alcove hearing Seraphine's carefully controlled voice outline the final details of a betrayal centuries in the making, and she had made a decision. She had gone to the signing room 40 minutes before the ceremony. She had not known then how to find the specific clauses. She had known the general structure of the documents because she had, in her invisible way, absorbed everything she could about them over 3 months. She went through them section by section, knowing she might be interrupted at any moment, knowing that if she was found there, it would not simply be termination of employment. She found the first altered clause in 11 minutes. The second took 4. The third was the one buried in the archaic dialect and she almost missed it twice before the linguistic pattern resolved itself, and she saw what it was doing. She photographed everything. Then she straightened the documents precisely as she had found them, walked to the service elevator, changed out of her uniform and into street clothes in 30 seconds flat, and went to find Draven Malkavian's private secretary. She did not reach him. What she reached instead was Kalen, who had apparently been watching the corridors more carefully than she had realized, and who looked at her with those calm, calculating eyes and said, in a voice that was perfectly pleasant, "I do not think you want to do what you are about to do, Miss Ashborne." "I expect you have reasons for believing that," she said. "Several," he replied, "beginning with the fact that you have no standing in this court, and no one will believe a human maid over 2 members of the inner circle. Lord Malkavian will look at the documents himself if I can reach him," she said. "He will see it." "Lord Malkavian," Kalen said softly, "will be in the signing chamber in 32 minutes, by which point you will have been escorted from the building, and the documents will have been adjusted to remove your photographs from the equation." She had not thought about that. She thought about it now very fast and realized he was right. She also realized, looking at him, that he was not threatening her with violence. He was telling her the truth of the situation in a way that was almost strangely informative, as if he wanted her to understand the specific shape of the wall she was running into. "You could stop it yourself," she said. "If you have a conscience somewhere under all of that." Something moved across his face, just for a moment. Then it was gone. "The accord signing begins in 31 minutes, he said. "You should leave the building." She did not leave the building. She took the service stairs to the 43rd floor, which was Draven's private level, and which she was not authorized to access, and which she had never entered in 8 months. She used the cleaning staff master key that she was not supposed to have retained from last month's emergency access for the water damage inspection, which she had not returned because she had simply neglected to, and because something in her had been quietly telling her for weeks that she should not quite yet. She walked through rooms that were extraordinary in their austerity, in the way they reflected a personality that did not perform luxury but simply inhabited it. And she found the private study, and she wrote everything down on paper, every altered clause and every implication in plain language, and she sealed it in an envelope with his name on it. And she went back downstairs. She reached the signing chamber corridor with 11 minutes to spare. Vothric was standing at the door. He looked at her with the particular expression reserved for things that were beneath his attention. "This is a restricted area," he said. "I need to deliver something to Lord Malkavian," she said. "I will take it." She looked at him. She thought about Kalen's face in the corridor. She thought about the signing happening in 11 minutes. She thought about the fact that Vothric was old enough and positioned closely enough to Seraphine that she could not determine with certainty where his loyalties actually sat. "No," she said. "Thank you." She turned around, walked to the far end of the corridor, found the second service entrance to the signing chamber that existed for catering and maintenance access, used the master key, and walked in through the back of the room. Draven Malkavian was standing at the signing table. The representatives of House Varek and House Sorvain were arranged across from him. Seraphine stood to his left. Calvin stood slightly further back. The room was full of the particular electric stillness that precedes significant events. Every head in the room turned to look at her. She walked the length of the room, She was aware that she was in her work uniform, that her hair was slightly disordered from the stairs, that she was a human maid walking into the most significant vampire political event in decades. She was aware that every person in that room, with possible exception of the person she was walking toward, considered her categorically irrelevant. She stopped in front of Draven Malkavian and held out the envelope. He looked at her. Those silver eyes were extraordinary up close. They were the color of old mirrors, and they held the particular quality of intelligence that does not need to announce itself because it is simply always at work. "Lord Malkavian," she said, "my name is Rosalie Ashborne. I am a maid in your household. I believe the documents on that table have been altered against your interest, and I have written down what I found and where. I am asking you to read it before you sign." The silence in the room was so complete, she could hear her own pulse. Seraphine said, "This is outrageous. Remove her immediately." Draven did not move. He looked at the envelope. He looked at her face. Something in his expression, something so precisely controlled that she doubted anyone else in the room saw it, shifted. He took the envelope. He read it. The room had to watch him, read it, because there was nothing else to do. When he finished, he read it again. Then he set it down on the signing table and looked at the documents and found the first altered clause in approximately 45 seconds. He found the archaic dialect clause in 2 minutes. He was clearly fluent in it. The room was very still for a long time. Then Draven Malkavian turned to Seraphine and said, in a voice like iron in winter, "Leave this room." The rest of that night was not her night. It belonged to vampire politics and blood law consequences, and the specific and terrible machinery of justice within an ancient court. And Rosalie had gone quietly back to the service corridors, and then to the staff dormitory, and sat on her bed until her hands stopped shaking. She was called to the 43rd floor the following morning. Draven Malkavian stood at the window of his private study, looking at the city. He did not look like the thunderstorm she had been warned about. He looked like a man who had not slept, which she knew was not literally true for a vampire, but was nonetheless an accurate description of what was sitting in his face. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He turned from the window and looked at her for a long moment. "You have been in my household for 8 months," he said. "Yes." "You read the Accord documents?" "Yes." "You identified alterations in archaic court dialect that my own legal counsel missed." "Your legal counsel was not looking for alterations," she said. "Why were you looking?" She told him about Rafornichin and Kalen in the alcove, and the acoustics of the corridor, and the decision she had made. She told him about Kalen stopping her, and what Kalen had said, and why she had decided to try anyway. He listened to all of it, without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Why did you not simply leave the building as Kalen suggested?" She considered the question seriously. "Because you had signed that benefits package," she said finally. "The one with the non-compulsion clause and the medical coverage. I figured someone who wrote that contract was worth the risk." Another long silence. Something in his face was doing something she could not quite read. "You risked your safety for a benefits package," he said. "I risked it for the person who wrote one," she said. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Seraphine and Kalen have been removed from court and are facing blood law tribunal. Vothric has been cleared. The accord has been postponed pending renegotiation on accurate terms. House Varric is in a very difficult position." He paused. "None of this would have happened without you." "It would have happened differently," she said. "Yes," he said. "It would have." He moved to the chair across from her and sat, which she had not expected. There was something deliberate about it, about choosing to sit across from rather than above. I would like to understand how you knew where to look and what to look for. The archaic dialect specifically, she had studied it. She told him that too. She told him about the linguistics coursework she had done 2 years before, while working 2 jobs and managing Theo's first round of treatment. The ancient language module she had taken for reasons she could not entirely explain, except that the structure of it had interested her, and she had always been drawn to the logic of old systems. She told him about the reading she had done on blood law, because it was relevant to the contract she had signed, and she believed in understanding what she was agreeing to. He listened to all of it, and when she finished, he said something she did not expect. He said, "I would like you to stay, not as a maid," she eventually understood, as something that did not have a precise name in his court's hierarchy, which was itself significant because his court's hierarchy had precise names for everything. She became, over the following months, the person who occupied the space that no title quite described, who read things and noticed things, and told him what she saw without any particular agenda beyond accuracy. She sat in on briefings, at first at the back of the room where she could have been missed if anyone tried. She was not missed. She was looked at with everything from confusion to barely concealed resentment by the court members who had remained after the tribunal, because they could not categorize her, and what could not be categorized was unsettling. She paid them the same careful attention she had always paid everything in the tower, filing away what she learned, and she came to understand, gradually, that the betrayal had cost Draven more than the accord itself. It had cost him certainty. 400 years was a long time to build a court. It was long enough that the people within it became, in some fundamental way, extensions of how you understood yourself, reflections of your judgment and your trust. Seraphine had been part of his court for over a century, Caelan for 60 years. Their betrayal was not simply a political wound. It was the kind that cut at the foundations of how a person understood whether their own perception could be trusted. She watched him work through it. She watched him be extraordinary at the external machinery of his position, flawless and commanding at every formal function, every negotiation, every public moment. She watched him be something different in the quieter hours, in the private study after the court had retired. When he sat with documents, he was reading for the 4th time, because his mind kept finding reasons not to trust its own conclusions. She brought him coffee, which he did not drink, but seemed to find he did not mind her bringing. She sat across from him and read her own manerials or worked through the briefing documents he had started giving her to review. She did not try to fix what was broken in him because she understood, with a precision born of personal experience, that certain kinds of damage do not get fixed, they get carried. What she could do was be a presence that was completely without hidden motive, because she had no court standing to gain, and no political position to protect, and no ambition that required his favor. She was simply there, reliably and without performance. And over months that turned out to matter more than either of them had understood it would. The accord renegotiation took 5 months. She sat in on every meeting. Twice she passed him notes mid-session with observations about linguistic framing and proposals from the Varec representatives, and he read them without looking surprised and incorporated the points into his responses so smoothly that the Varec team never knew where they had come from. The final accord, the genuine one, was signed on a Tuesday evening in the same chamber where the trap had almost closed. She stood at the back of the room. He signed the documents, and then, before the room had fully registered that the ceremony was complete, he looked directly at her across the space. Just for a moment, just long enough that she felt it like something physical, that silver gaze, finding her with the same precision it applied to everything. She looked back at him and did not look away. After that, things moved differently between them. Though it happened so gradually, she almost did not see it. He found reasons for her presence in settings where there was no professional justification for her being there. She found herself thinking about him in ways she was perfectly clear with herself. Nothing like professional. She was clear with herself about this because she believed in clarity. She believed in knowing what you felt, even when what you felt was complicated. What she felt was that he was the most extraordinary person she had ever been near, and that the more she understood him, the more she admired him. And that admiration had somewhere along the way acquired a warmth that was not admiration. She was also clear with herself that it was an impossible feeling, not because of the power differential, though she was not naive about that, not because of the vampire and human distinction, though she was not naive about that either, because of who he was. Because Draven Malkavian was 400 years old and had ruled one of the most powerful vampire courts in existence, and whatever warmth she had developed for him was almost certainly nothing like what she imagined it might be on his side. He valued her. He trusted her. Those were significant things, and she knew better than to let her heart translate them into something they were not. She had been thinking, carefully and practically, about the fact that Theo's treatment was going well and would conclude in another year, about the fact that what she had become in this court was real, but was also built on a very particular set of circumstances that could change. She had been building, quietly, the architecture of eventually, then came the rooftop. The betrayal had a deeper root that she had not known about, that he had not spoken about, that surfaced in the months after the tribunal in the form of findings the blood law investigators turned up in the process of building the case against Seraphine. Seraphine had been working with an outside party for 30 years, not House Varric, as the Accord trap had suggested, but a far older and more dangerous alliance, a faction within vampire society so ancient and so embedded that it predated the current house system entirely. They called themselves the Conclave of the First Night, which was either magnificent or absurd, depending on how seriously you took their actual power, and their actual power was considerable. The Conclave believed that the current vampire house system, with its human employee contracts and its blood law protections and its formal diplomatic relationships with human governments, was a debasement of what vampires were. They believed that the old world, the world before agreements, the world in which vampire lords simply held power without the architecture of covenants and contracts, was the correct world. They had been working for decades to destabilize the major houses from within, and Draven's house had been their primary target, because Draven was, in their view, the most dangerous symbol of the current order. He was ancient and powerful, and he had chosen covenant. He had chosen to build a system where humans could work beside vampires under genuine protection. To the Conclave, he was the most threatening thing alive. The investigators found evidence that the Conclave's operations went further than the Accord trap. There had been 3 previous attempts, in the decades before she arrived, that Draven had not known were connected, and there was a fourth operation still running. They found out what it was on a night in January. The fourth operation was her, not her involvement, not her complicity, her as a target. The Conclave had identified her as a vulnerability in Draven's court, not because she was weak, but because she was human, and because she mattered to him, and because the blood law protections that made his court what it was also meant that she could not simply be defended by vampire methods. There were constraints on what protection looked like within the law, and the Conclave had spent months mapping those constraints. They planned to take her, not to kill her, which under blood law would have triggered a catastrophic response, but to hold her in a way that forced a choice. Forced Draven to either act in violation of the diplomatic agreements he had spent decades building, or accept the compromise of a person he cared for. It was a trap built entirely of his own values, designed to use what was best about him as the weapon against him. The investigator who delivered this briefing was named Aldros, and he was one of the oldest vampires in Draven's court, so old that his white hair had almost the texture of light. He laid the information out in careful, exhaustive order, and then looked at Draven with the expression of someone who had lived long enough to understand that information of this kind required a moment before the response. Rosalie was in the room. She had been in the room for the beginning of the briefing, and then the information had shifted direction, and she had understood quite precisely what she was hearing, and she had continued sitting there, because leaving would not make it less true. Draven had not looked at her during the briefing. After Aldros finished, he was very still for a long moment, and then he said quietly, "Leave us." Everyone left except her. He stood at the window again. She was developing a theory about the window, about what it meant when he stood there, about the specific quality of the distance he was seeking when he put glass between himself and the city. "You should be moved to a secure location," he said. His voice was controlled and measured, and she could hear exactly how much effort that was costing him. "That seems likely to be true," she said. "There are options." He turned from the window. She had learned his face well enough by now that she could read the things it was doing under the things it showed. "I can move you to the second estate in the north. Full security. Aldros's team on permanent rotation. They cannot reach you there without triggering a blood law response so severe it would effectively end the Conclave." "That sounds like a reasonable solution," she said. "There is a second option," he said. "Formal court designation. If you hold an official court title, the blood law protections are different in kind, more direct, more absolute." He paused. "Permanent." She looked at him. "What kind of title?" A long pause. "The kind that cannot be revoked unless you choose to revoke it," he said. "The kind that would require the full weight of my house's power to be considered before anyone moved against you." Another pause, longer. "The kind that would be, in the language of vampire court law, a declaration of primary bond." She understood what he was saying. She understood it in pieces that assembled themselves with the particular clarity that arrived when something she had told herself was impossible became suddenly, shockingly possible. "Draven," she said. His name in her mouth without the title was something she had never done before. She watched his face register it. "I am not asking you to decide tonight," he said. His voice had changed. The control was still there, but it was doing something different now. It was not holding distance, it was holding care. "I am not asking you to decide as a function of safety. I am telling you there are options, and that one of them is also something I would want regardless of the Conclave's existence." She stood up. She crossed the room to where he was standing at the window, and she looked up at him, at that extraordinary face, at the silver eyes that were doing nothing, controlled at all in this moment. "You should have said something sooner," she said. "You are human," he said, and it was not said as a limitation. It was said as a thing that he had been turning over for months, a thing that carried weight. "You are 26 years old. I am 4 centuries older than you. What I feel for you is not something I have a clean moral framework for acting on, Rosalie. I have been trying to work out whether I had the right." She thought about that. She thought about it seriously, because it deserved seriousness, because he deserved that from her. She thought about what it meant to be 26 and fully formed and capable of deciding for herself what she wanted. She thought about the difference between a power imbalance that constrained and one that was chosen with open eyes. "I have been working out something similar," she said. "I have been telling myself that what I felt was not what I thought it was, because I was afraid of being wrong about something that mattered this much." He reached up and touched her face. His hand was cool against her cheek, and she had known intellectually that he would be cold. She had known it the way you know facts, but the actual reality of it was something else entirely. It was extraordinary. It was one of the most real things she had ever felt. "Tell me what you thought it was," he said. "I thought it was the most important thing that had ever happened to me," she said. He kissed her. It was not what she had expected, which was something consuming and overwhelming. It was careful. It was precise. It was the way he did everything, with complete attention, as if she was something he wanted to understand entirely and had chosen to begin. At the beginning, when he pulled back, his eyes were open and looking at her, and she had never in her life been looked at like that, like she was specific, like she was the exact and correct thing. "The Northern Estate," she said, "for now, until the Conclave situation is resolved." "Yes," he said, "and then we address the rest." "Yes," he said again, and he was not controlling his expression anymore, and what was in his face was something that a person who had seen him in court, in negotiations, in the cold, brilliant machinery of his public life, would not have recognized. It was simple. It was warm. It was a man who had been carrying 4 centuries of accumulated solitude and had found, in the most unlikely person, in the most unlikely set of circumstances, a reason to set it down. The Northern Estate was a place she had not known existed, tucked into a mountain landscape 3 hours from the city, behind walls that looked from the outside like a research institute, and from the inside like something built by someone who understood what beauty was for. She brought Theo to visit twice during the following weeks, and he sat in the vast library the second time and looked around at the walls of books, and then at her with an expression of complete bewilderment that she found deeply satisfying. Theo knew, in the way younger brothers, with older sisters, who raised them, knew things, that she had never done anything casually or accidentally, but this apparently exceeded his capacity for inference. "The vampire lord," he said. "Yes," she said. "You walked into a vampire court signing ceremony." "Yes, in your work uniform. I did not have time to change." He looked at her for a very long time. Then he said, "I have missed you is all," which was not what she had expected him to say, and which meant everything. And she sat beside him in the library and let the fire do its work on the cold air outside the windows. The conclave moved faster than anticipated. Aldros's intelligence on their timeline had been accurate, but their secondary protocol had not been fully mapped. They had a contingency that activated when they detected that their primary target had been moved to protected ground. The contingency did not target Rosalie. It targeted something else. It targeted the renegotiated accord. The Conclave had a member inside House Varek's legal team. It took Aldros 4 days to confirm it. 4 days during which Rosalie went through the renegotiated documents again, with the same methodical attention she had applied 8 months earlier to the first set of trap documents. She found 2 clauses that had been introduced in the final revision stage, both of them in the kind of language that slid past attention without the precise focus she had trained herself to bring. She brought the findings to Draven at 2 in the morning with a pot of coffee she still made every night, despite everything, and which he still did not drink, and which seemed none the less to remain a relevant fixture of their working dynamic. He read through her analysis without speaking. When he reached the end, he set it down and looked at her across the desk. "How long did this take you?" he said. "Since yesterday morning," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Come here," he said. She came around the desk. He pulled her into his arms and held her, which he had begun to do in the private hours, with a consistency that she was still, in some small interior way, astonished by, that this extraordinary, ancient, controlled person found something in simply holding her that he chose over and over to seek. She rested her head against his shoulder and felt his arms around her and let herself be completely still for 60 seconds. Then she said, "We need to contact House Sorvain before House Varek knows the clauses have been found." He exhaled against her hair, which was the closest she had heard him come to a laugh. "Yes," he said, "we do." The Conclave's internal member within House Varek was identified and removed within 72 hours. The altered clauses were corrected. The Conclave, having failed twice on major operations against Draven's house, and having had their infiltration of House Varek's legal team exposed to all 3 accord houses simultaneously, found themselves in a position of blood law scrutiny from multiple directions. Old alliances they had relied on for decades began quietly dissolving. The architecture they had built over 30 years started to show its load-bearing points, and then began, one by one, to fail. It did not happen overnight. The Conclave was ancient, and its members were not foolish, and the dismantling of something that old is never simple or swift. But the direction was clear, and the momentum was clear, and Draven had enough of both to know that the existential threat was resolving. It was during this period that the thing on the rooftop had happened. She had not fully understood it until she was sitting beside him with her back against the parapet and the city spreading out below. And he was talking, really talking, in the dark, in a way she suspected he had not talked to anyone in a very long time. The weight was not just the Conclave. The weight was 400 years of it. The weight was the accumulating evidence of betrayal by people he had trusted, and the way that evidence had been stripping away, layer by layer, his ability to trust his own judgment. The weight was the question of whether the court he had built, the agreements, the contracts, the protections, the entire architecture of covenants and blood law that he had spent centuries constructing, was actually what he believed it to be, or whether it was something that had been infiltrated so thoroughly that the structure itself was compromised. The weight was 400 years of carrying the whole thing, and the specific exhaustions who has been strong for so long that the body of their strength has become its own kind of prison. She did not try to argue him out of any of it. She listened. She asked questions, not the practical kind, but the kind that were about what he had wanted when he began, what he had believed was possible, what had felt true in the first century of building before the inevitable weight began to accumulate. She asked because she was genuinely curious, and because she had learned that the best thing she could do for someone who was drowning in their own thoughts was give them something real to talk to. Not a solution, not a reframe, a person, an actual presence. He talked until the sky changed. When the first light came, he said, very quietly, "I did not intend for anyone to find me up here. I know," she said. "I do not know what I was going to do," he said, which she did not quite believe, but also understood as the closest he could come, in that moment, to acknowledging what the rooftop had been about. "You were going to step back," she said, "because you are still here." He turned his head and looked at her. In the growing dawn light, his face was extraordinary, white hair loose around it, silver eyes tired in the way that was not physical, but was the specific tiredness of someone who has been carrying something a very long distance. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am practical," she said. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known," he said, "and I have known 4 centuries of people." She reached over and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers immediately. The cool grip of them, exactly the thing it had always been, specific and real. "Then let me be practical about this," she said. "The court is not compromised. You know that because you can see what it withstood. The Conclave spent 30 years trying to hollow it out from inside, and you still have Aldros, you still have Vothric, you still have the Accord, the structure held. That is what you built." She paused. "And you have me, and I am not leaving, so you are going to have to find a way to keep doing this, because I have been watching you do it for over a year, and I believe in it, and I am not prepared to stop." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he brought their joined hands up and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, and it was not a dramatic gesture, but it was one of the most deliberate things she had ever seen him do. "Come inside," he said. They went inside. In the weeks that followed, things settled in ways that were gradual and also irreversible. Draven's court underwent formal restructuring. Aldros took a significantly expanded role in intelligence and security. Vothric, who had been quietly shaken by the revelation of how close to him the betrayal had run, threw himself into establishing new verification protocols with the particular energy of someone who needed to rebuild something concrete. 2 new court advisors were brought in, both of them with transparent histories, and neither of them with ties to any house that had been in the Conclave's orbit, and Rosalie's role was formalized. The formal court designation happened in the court chamber, with the full house present, in a ceremony that was in the old tradition, and therefore had the quality of something ancient and serious, and not to be taken lightly. The declaration of primary bond in vampire blood law was not marriage in the human sense, though it held similar weight and several additional layers of legal complexity. It was an irrevocable declaration of priority. It meant that in any conflict between the House's interests and her safety and well-being, she came first. It meant that the full weight of the House and its alliances and its ancient power was formally and permanently positioned between her and any threat. It meant that he had put her, in the language of his world and his law, at the absolute center. She had thought carefully about this. She had thought about what it meant to enter into something irrevocable, something that would bind her to a world she had entered through a service door with a cleaning cart. She had thought about Theo, who was finishing his treatment, and who had, in the end, simply looked at her and said that he had never known her to do anything she had not thought through completely, and he saw no reason to start doubting her now. She had thought about her own life, about what she wanted from it, about whether the answer to that question had been changing for over a year, in ways she had been tracking, but not quite yet acknowledging. She stood in the court chamber in something that was not her maid's uniform, and also not the kind of formal court dress that the vampire court members wore, because she was neither of those things, and she had no interest in pretending to be, but was instead a deep blue dress that was, Theo had told her, completely her, and which she had decided to take as the relevant endorsement. Draven stood across from her and spoke the declaration in the old language, the full formal archaic dialect of blood law, and his silver eyes were on her face throughout, and the room was absolute still. When he finished and looked at her, waiting, she said in clear, plain English, because it was her language and she had earned the right to declare things in it, "I choose this, I choose you, all of it, the whole complicated, ancient, occasionally catastrophic thing. I am not going anywhere." Something in the court chamber shifted. She heard it, felt it. The quality of the air changing as 30 vampires who had lived through centuries of formal proceedings registered something they recognized as real. Draven reached for her hands and held them, and she could feel through his grip what he was not going to say in front of his court. And she held his hands back just as firmly and let him know through her grip that she already knew. The months that followed were not without difficulty. The conclave did not dissolve quietly or quickly, and there were moments when the threat spiked in ways that required the full weight of Draven's resources to address. There was a night when Aldros's intelligence identified an active operation, and Draven was across the city at a diplomatic meeting and Rosalie was in the tower. And Vothric was so visibly distressed by the situation that she had to firmly tell him twice that she was perfectly fine in the secured suite, and he was not helping by hovering in the doorway. She spent that night the way she spent most crises, which was working. She had developed, over the previous months, a relationship with the Blood Law Archive that the court's official legal staff found alternately impressive and mildly threatening. She had become genuinely expert in the language and structure of vampire legal traditions, not because anyone asked her to, but because it interested her, and because it was useful, and because she was constitutionally incapable of being in proximity to a complex system without understanding how it worked. During the night of the active operation, she identified 3 historical precedents in the Blood Law Archive that were relevant to the Conclave's formal dissolution, which she compiled into a briefing that Aldros read the following morning and forwarded to the legal team with a note that said, in his extremely economical way, that this was very good work. When Draven returned from across the city at dawn, moving through the secured suite door with the contained, controlled urgency of someone who had been at a careful distance from something they very much wanted to be closer to, she was sitting at the desk with the briefing nearly complete and a pot of coffee beside her. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her, and the tension in his face resolved so completely and so quickly that it was almost visible, like watching a fist open. He crossed the room, pulled her out of the chair, and held her with a thoroughness that communicated rather effectively that whatever the diplomatic meeting had been about, whatever the night had demanded of the part of him, that was a court lord with obligations and authority and responsibilities whole. This was where the rest of him had been the entire time. She wrapped her arms around him and let him hold her. and thought, not for the first time, that being held by Draven Malkavian was one of the better things that had ever happened to her. The Conclave had a third option, he said into her hair. The operation tonight was a distraction. They were trying to draw Aldros's attention toward active movement while a legal challenge was filed in the old court registry. She pulled back enough to look at his face. The old court still has jurisdiction on blood law disputes, she said. Yes, he said. What kind of challenge? Against the designation, he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were doing the thing they did when something cost him more than he was going to say. Against the primary bond declaration. They filed a claim that it violates old codes of separation between human and vampire courts. The claim is almost certainly without merit. Almost certainly, she repeated. The separation codes were revised in 1887, he said. The revision is clear on this matter, but the filing requires a formal response, and the response requires me to stand before the old court registry and make the case. He paused, which I am more than prepared to do. She looked at him. And if the old court rules against you? They will not, he said, with the particular quality of conviction that she had come to understand was not arrogance, but something else, the precision of a person who has read every word of every relevant document and knows exactly where the ground is solid. She believed him. She also said, but if they did, walk me through it. What happens? He did. He sat across from her the way he always did, in the working hours, the desk between them, the coffee she had made present, even though it was not for him, and he walked her through every branch of the scenario with complete honesty. A ruling against the designation would require a dissolution process under blood law that was lengthy and contested and could be appealed at multiple stages. It would not be immediate. It would not be the end of anything fundamental between them. It would simply mean a longer fight. I have fought longer fights, he said. I know, she said. I have watched you. She reached across the desk and put her hand on top of his, the way she had on the rooftop in the dark. We fight it together, if it comes to that. He turned his hand under hers and laced his fingers through hers. You understand what you are signing on for, he said. Not a question, an acknowledgement. I have understood it since I read your benefits package, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then something in his face did the thing that it had done increasingly often over the months, that quiet transformation, that setting down of the weight. The old court ruled in their favor 4 weeks later. The separation codes from 1887 were unambiguous, and the Conclave's filing was found to be without sufficient basis in current blood law to proceed. The ruling was documented and added to the blood law archive, which Rosalie noted with some satisfaction as she read through the formal record, as a precedent for the protection of primary bond declarations across vampire and human parties. It would be there now in the archive for anyone else who needed it. The Conclave's final formal dissolution came 6 months after the rooftop. It was not a dramatic event. It was a series of legal proceedings and voluntary surrenders and a few confrontations that Draven handled with the efficient and slightly terrifying authority that she had watched him bring to every genuine threat. And then it was done. The structure that had been working against his house for 30 years was simply gone, its members either facing blood law consequences or having made the calculation that they preferred the current world order to the alternative. The last of the intelligence files were closed. Aldros gave a briefing that was, for Aldros, almost cheerful. Rosalie stood at the window of the 43rd floor that evening, where Draven usually stood, looking out at the city. He came to stand beside her. "It is done," he said. "Yes," she said. "How does that feel from your perspective?" She considered. "Like the first day after a long illness," she said, "where you wake up and the thing that was wrong is gone, and you are still getting used to the shape of what it feels like not to be bracing for it." He was quiet. Then he said, "That is exactly accurate." She looked up at him. The evening light was doing something precise and specific to his face, catching the silver of his eyes, throwing shadows that defined the extraordinary architecture of his features. She had looked at him so many times and had never gotten used to it, which she had decided was simply the truth and deserved to be acknowledged. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask when I found you on the rooftop," she said. "Before everything that happened after, before the Conclave was resolved and the designation and all of it. What were you feeling specifically?" I never asked directly. He was quiet for a long time. She waited the way she had learned to wait for him, without filling the silence. "I was feeling the specific weight of an immortal life from which the meaning had been, I believed, entirely removed," he said. "I had built something for 4 centuries and watched people I trusted spend decades quietly dismantling it from the inside. And in that moment, the accumulation of evidence suggested that the thing I had built was not what I believed it to be, that the covenant model I had chosen, the agreements, the protections, the human partnerships, was a fantasy I had permitted myself, because I found the alternative too difficult." He paused. "I was feeling that I had been wrong about everything, and that there was no point in continuing to be wrong about it." She was quiet for a moment. "And now," she said. He looked at her. "Now I know I was wrong about being wrong," he said, "which is a more complicated relationship with certainty than I generally prefer, but I find I have made my peace with it." She smiled. He watched her smile with the particular attention he brought to it, which she had long since stopped being self-conscious about and had started simply enjoying. "Good," she said, "because I have several more years of compiling your blood law archive before I am satisfied that it is adequately organized, and I will need you available. I believe the position of head archivist is currently unfilled," he said, which was as close as Draven Malkavian got to teasing, and which she had come to treasure the same way she treasured his particular way of reaching for her hand. "I am already doing the job," she said. "You simply have not given me the title." "I gave you a rather significant title," he said. "That one was for other reasons," she said. He reached out and tucked a piece of her dark hair behind her ear with the kind of deliberate gentleness that a person with 4 centuries of history and vampire court authority applied when they had decided to be gentle. "For every reason I know," he said quietly. "Every one." She leaned into his hand the way she did in the private hours, the way she had stopped pretending not to want to, the way she had been completely honest with herself about since the night on the rooftop when she had stood beside him, and understood that being present for this person was the most important thing she had ever done. "I know," she said. Outside the window, the city ran on, full of its ordinary and extraordinary motions, the lights coming up in the dusk as they always did, the streets full of people moving through their lives. Somewhere out there, Theo was finishing his treatment and planning a future. Somewhere in the lower floors of the tower, Aldros was reading the final closure documents with his economical satisfaction. Vothric was running his new verification protocols with the energy of a person who had found something constructive to do with a year's worth of redirected anxiety. The court had stabilized into something that felt, for the first time in a long time, like what it had been built to be. She was 27 years old, and she was standing at the window of a vampire lord's private study, with his hand against her face and her heart completely, irreversibly full. She had walked into this tower invisible. She had been the woman no one saw, the maid with the cleaning cart, the background presence that the important people talked around and above and through. She had used that invisibility carefully and purposefully, and she did not regret a single day of it. But she was not invisible now. She was seen completely and specifically, and with a precision that she had given up expecting from the world, by the one person whose perception of her she had come to understand mattered more than any other. Draven drew her closer, and she went, and the city lights spread out below them, and the archive was waiting, and the court was steady, and Theo was well, and the blood law of it all was settled and documented and filed, and she was home. It was not the home she had planned for. It was better. It was the kind that arrived at the end of a sequence of decisions you had made, each one as honestly and as carefully as you knew how, until you were standing in a place that was completely yours, by virtue of the work you had done to reach it. She had read his contract and taken his job and paid attention to everything, and walked into a ceremony in her work uniform and sat on a rooftop in the dark and told him the truth. And the truth had turned out to be this him, them, the whole, complicated, ancient, extraordinary thing. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That I am exactly where I want to be," she said. His arms settled around her. Outside the window the city carried on, bright and alive, and inside the 43rd floor of Malkavian Tower, in the private study that smelled of old books and the particular cold, clean air of him, the two of them were still together, which was the most important fact of either of their lives. And they both knew it. "Stay," he said. "Not a command, a request. I already told you," she said. "I am not leaving." She felt him exhale against her hair, slow and complete, the specific release of the person who has carried something alone for a long time and has been given, finally, permission to set it down in the presence of someone who will not let it fall. The city lights came up fully in the dark outside the window. The archive was full of precedents they had built together. The court was alive and steady and real, and Draven Malkavian, who was 400 years old and white-haired and silver-eyed and more powerful than anyone she had ever known, held the woman who had walked him back from the edge as though she was the most precious and irreplaceable thing in his ancient world. She was.